The blistering intensity of Sarin 4 was insufferable for most life forms, yet Colonel Adrian Shaw was hardly affected. His battle attire's temperature regulation had ceased functioning long ago, and the relentless sunshine thickened the atmosphere around him like viscous syrup. His squad hastened to construct barricades and fortify their positions in anticipation of the imminent onslaught from the Ral horde. Nearby, the Turani with their luminescent shells glistened subtly under the severe sunlight, proving themselves as astute allies albeit exceedingly cautious. Adrian had devoted much of the past week persuading them to maintain their stance on Sarin 4. The Ralk's offensive posed a severe threat to a vital supply route, making retreat unacceptable. Colonel Charmaine, the Tiani leader, articulated through his translator, questioning the defensibility of their position given the apparent vulnerability of the troops. Facing Maine, coated in dust and perspiration, Adrian retorted, "Fragile, you say? Just watch and you'll witness our resilience." Maine's antennae twitched in doubt but offered no response. Instead, he observed as Adrian's soldiers, visibly fatigued yet efficient, bolstered their fortifications. Shortly after, the initial wave of Ralks attacked. These creatures, resembling nightmares, were massive, quadruped beasts with layered armor and jagged limbs, designed for rending steel, advancing with a disturbing swiftness, a tide of talons and chitin charging across the desolate plains. "Hold firm," Adrian commanded, his voice slicing through the growls and gunshots as his team unleashed a barrage of bullets and energy beams. Despite their formidable appearance, the beasts collapsed under the concentrated firepower, though their sheer numbers soon overwhelmed the barricades. Corporal Mendez was the first to fall, a Ralk's talon gashing his shoulder. Though he screamed, he continued to fire his pistol until the beast fell. Another soldier, Private Harris, was hurled. Against the barrier, his leg grotesquely twisted. He dragged himself back, propped his rifle on the barricade, and resumed firing. The Turani, positioned slightly behind the humans, faltered. Adrian sensed Maine's gaze on him as he continued to shoot, downing another Ralks. "Colonel Charmaine," buzzed the translator, "your soldiers are critically wounded. They should withdraw for medical aid." "No retreat," Adrian insisted, loading another magazine. "If they're still breathing, that's sufficient." Maine clicked in what Adrian had learned to interpret as perplexity, questioning the logic in persisting through pain, suggesting it invited further harm. "Explain that to the Turani," Adrian suggested, nodding towards Mendez who, despite his injury, had managed a makeshift sling and was now fending off two Ralks single-handedly. The battle intensified as the second wave adapted, pinpointing the humans' vulnerabilities. Adrian watched as Harris, pale from blood loss, hurled a grenade into a cluster of charging beasts. The blast decimated the enemy, but a shrapnel shard embedded in Harris's side. He fell back, clutching his wound, yet his voice still commanded the line to hold. A surge of pride mixed with fury surged through Adrian. "Maintain that," he ordered. Meanwhile, the Turani struggled to stay coherent. One of their warriors, Yeek, collapsed after a glancing blow from a Ralk's claw, his limbs locking in a defensive posture. "Mazin, your people need to regroup," Adrian snapped as Yeek lay incapacitated. "He cannot fight," Maine responded. "The injury impairs his structural integrity. To continue would be reckless." "Welcome to the fray," Adrian muttered, stepping over a fallen Ralks and firing into the advancing enemy. As hours turned into a relentless battle, humans endured relentless hits, their bodies battered yet unyielding. Mendez, despite his severely injured shoulder, rigged an explosive at a barricade. Harris, barely conscious, directed fire from his position on the ground. Even Adrian, with a gash from a Ralk's claw on his leg, refused to retreat. When the final wave ebbed, the battlefield was a smoldering wasteland. Adrian surveyed the scene, his chest heaving, the Ralks retreating, their ranks decimated. His soldiers, too exhausted to celebrate, leaned against the barriers but were alive. Maine approached cautiously, his shell scratched and dented from minor impacts, observing the humans with newfound intensity. "You and your soldiers," Maine stated slowly, acknowledging the injuries that would have incapacitated most species, "continue to function, defying our understanding of physiological limits." "It's not about biology," Adrian replied, limping towards Maine. "It's about survival. Pain is just part of the equation." Maine's antennae swayed, possibly in disbelief, marveling at the human's resilience which seemed bordering on madness. "Your ability to endure surpasses any we've encountered," he admitted. Adrian offered a weary smile. "Welcome to humanity." As medics tended to the wounded, Maine lingered, his compound eyes scanning the battlefield, finally turning to Adrian. "Colonel Shaw, this conflict raises questions. I must consult with my council." Watching him leave, Adrian then turned to his troops. Despite the pain radiating through his body, he felt a grim satisfaction. The Turani might not fully grasp humanity yet, but they were beginning to understand what made humans formidable. The aftermath left little time for rest. The defensive outpost on Sarin 4, battered yet standing, had become a stark triage center. Medics scurried between makeshift care stations, attending to soldiers whose injuries ranged from severe lacerations to fractures. Adrian Shaw, sitting on the edge of a supply crate with his leg hastily bandaged, barely noticed the blood seeping through the fabric. "What's the situation, Mendez?" he inquired, eyeing the sergeant cradling his injured arm in a sling. "Rough, sir," Mendez responded. "We lost about a third of the unit. The rest are battered but ready to fight if needed." Adrian nodded, his jaw tightening. They would have to. The Turani gathered near their less numerous wounded. Maine stood apart, his antennae twitching erratically as he observed the humans. It was evident the battle had unsettled him, not just because of the Rauks but due to what he had witnessed in the humans. "Colonel Charmaine," he approached Adrian cautiously, "your soldiers exhibit a pattern of behavior we cannot rationalize. They persist in combat despite significant injuries, some continuing even after sustaining potentially fatal wounds." "Yeah, that's called determination," Adrian replied tersely. Maine tilted his head, inquiring if determination was some form of chemical influence or neural override. Sighing, Adrian explained, "It's neither. It's a choice, a mindset. When things get hard, we don't quit." Pondering this concept, Maine remarked, "It seems to supersede survival instinct. How is this beneficial?" Adrian leaned in, fixing Maine with a stern look. "Because sometimes survival isn't about staying safe. It's about enduring through the pain to accomplish what's necessary. You don't win a war by avoiding the tough parts." Before Maine could respond, the distant rumble of approaching Rauks forces interrupted, the sound growing with every second. "Looks like they're returning," Mendez muttered, eyeing the horizon. Adrian stood, wincing as his injured leg protested. "Sound the alarm. Get everyone ready." The defensive line was swiftly reinforced, barricades patched with salvaged materials, and ammunition carefully rationed. The soldiers, battered but resolute, took their positions, their faces grim but determined. The Turani, however, hesitated. "Mazin," Adrian called, motioning the alien leader over, "your people need to step up. We can't hold this line without you." Mazin's antennae twitched uncertainly. "We are not equipped for prolonged engagement. Our physiology does not permit sustained injury." "Then don't get injured," Adrian snapped, "but you're in this fight whether you like it or not." The Rauks attacked with renewed ferocity, the ground shaking under their charge, their screeches piercing the air like a chorus of nightmares. Adrian's rifle barked as he fired into the advancing horde, each shot carefully aimed. The line held, barely. A Raux leapt over the barricade, its claws raking across Mendez's torso before Adrian brought it down with a well-placed shot. The sergeant fell, blood pooling beneath him. "Medic!" Adrian shouted, but Mendez waved him off, propping himself against the barricade. "I'm not done yet," Mendez growled, grabbing a sidearm and firing into the fray. Nearby, Harris, his legs still mangled from a previous battle, used the butt of his rifle to fend off a Raux that had gotten too close. He was pale, his movements sluggish, but his resolve never wavered. "Stay down, damn it," Harris shouted as he swung the rifle again, the impact cracking the creature's carapace. The Turani, watching from their position, seemed paralyzed by what they were witnessing. Mazen's translator buzzed faintly as he muttered to himself. "Mazen!" Adrian shouted, reloading his weapon. "Get your people moving." The alien leader hesitated for a moment longer before finally giving the order. The Turani moved into action, their energy weapons slicing through the Raux with surgical precision, but it was clear they were struggling to keep up with the relentless pace of the humans. As the battle dragged on, the Raux began to falter, their numbers thinned, their attacks less coordinated, and finally, they began to retreat. A cheer went up from the humans, though it was short-lived. The cost of the victory was evident in the bodies that littered the battlefield and the exhausted, wounded soldiers who remained. Adrian sank to the ground, his leg throbbing painfully. Around him, medics scrambled to tend to the injured. Maine approached, his movements slow and deliberate. "Colonel Charmaine," he said, his tone unusually subdued, "your species continues to confound us. Your soldiers fought through injuries that should have incapacitated them. Some even appeared to fight harder after being wounded. How is this possible?" Adrian leaned back against a piece of rubble, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because that's what it takes when everything's on the line. You don't stop to think about how much it hurts. You just keep going." Maine was silent for a long moment, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the carnage around them. "Your pain tolerance is not a mere physical trait. It is something else, something we do not possess. You have your tactics, your precision," Adrian said. "We've got our stubbornness. Guess that's why we make a good team." Maine's antenna twitched thoughtfully. "Perhaps there's more to your species than we anticipated," he admitted. Adrian gave a tired smile. "You're just figuring that out now?" As the sun set over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the ravaged landscape, Adrian knew the fight wasn't over. The Raux would return, stronger and more determined than before. But for now, they had bought themselves a little more time and earned the respect of their alien allies. The night on Saren 4 was as hostile as its days, the temperature plummeting to sub-zero levels as if the planet sought to punish anyone foolish enough to remain. Fires from the battlefield flickered faintly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows over the wreckage and debris. Colonel Adrian Shaw sat near one of these fires, his leg freshly bandaged and his rifle across his knees. Around him, his soldiers rested where they could, their exhaustion evident in every movement. Adrian's comm unit buzzed, pulling him from his brief respite. "Shaw here," he said. "Sir, perimeter sensors are picking up movement," a weary voice crackled back. It was Lieutenant Crane, stationed at the northern watch point. Adrian stood with a grimace, his injured leg protesting every step. "Route unclear. Could be stragglers, could be a scout team." "I'll take a look," Adrian replied, signaling to Mendez. The sergeant, his torso swathed in bandages, joined Adrian without hesitation, his sidearm holstered but ready. The two made their way to the watch point, where a handful of soldiers were stationed with night vision scopes. Crane handed Adrian a scope and pointed toward the horizon. "There, just past the third ridge." Adrian peered through the scope, his jaw tightening. A cluster of figures moved in the distance, their movements deliberate but not immediately threatening. "We're too small to be Ralk." He lowered the scope and turned to Mendez. "Let's go see what they want." The approach was slow and cautious, the cold air biting against their skin. When they finally closed the distance, Adrian recognized the figures as Turani. Mazin was among them, his shimmering carapace dulled by the cold. "Colonel Shah Mazin," Adrian said as he and Mendez approached. "We observed the sensors and chose to investigate. It seems your soldiers are indisposed." "They're exhausted," Adrian replied flatly. "What's your excuse for being out here?" Maine hesitated, his antennae twitching slightly. "The Ralks are regrouping. They will return by dawn." Adrian swore under his breath. "How many?" "Our estimates suggest twice their previous force." "Twice," Mendez muttered. "We barely held them off the first time." Adrian ignored the comment, focusing on Maine. "If you've got anything up your sleeve, now's the time to share." Maine's multifaceted eyes reflected the faint starlight as he responded. "We have limited resources. Our war doctrines prioritize minimal losses, which does not align with your species' methods." Adrian let out a humorless laugh. "You're saying we're too reckless." "Not reckless," Maine corrected. "Extraordinary and confounding." Adrian waved. "The compliment aside, what about reinforcements? Supplies? Anything?" Maine hesitated again. "Reinforcements are en route but will not arrive in time. However, there is one option. A munitions cache was left on this planet decades ago. It could be enough to bolster your defenses." "Then why are we just hearing about this now?" Mendez asked, his frustration barely contained. "The location of the cache is dangerous," Maine replied. "The terrain is treacherous, and the Ralks have claimed much of it as hunting grounds." Adrian sighed. "Dangerous or not, it's our best shot." "Where's the cache?" Maine extended a thin limb, gesturing to the east. 7 km that way, embedded in a ravine." 7 km of Ralks-infested hell, Mendez muttered. "Perfect." "We take a team," Adrian said, already mentally preparing. "If we don't come back, hold the line as long as you can." Maine's antennae flicked. "You intend to lead this mission personally?" "You're injured, Colonel Shaw." Adrian gave a tired smile. It wouldn't be the first time. By the time Adrian's team was assembled, the temperature had dropped further, frost forming on their weapons and gear. Mendez, Harris, and 3 other soldiers joined him, their faces grim but resolute. Maine, to Adrian's mild surprise, volunteered to guide them. The journey to the ravine was brutal, the rocky terrain uneven and sharp, and every step felt like an invitation for the Ralks to attack. The tension was palpable, every sound amplified by the silence of the frozen night. Halfway there, a guttural growl broke the stillness. The group froze, weapons raised. From the shadows, a Ralks scout emerged, its serrated limbs gleaming in the moonlight. "Take it down quietly," Adrian whispered, motioning to Harris. The private nodded, carefully lining up his shot. The suppressed round struck true, the creature collapsing with a soft thud. "Nice work," Mendez muttered. "Keep moving," Adrian ordered. The group pressed on, the ravine finally coming into view as dawn's faint light began to creep over the horizon. The cache was embedded in a sheer rock face, its metallic surface glinting faintly. "That's it," Maine said. "All right, let's get to work," Adrian said, motioning for his team to set up a defensive perimeter as they worked to access the cache. The telltale sound of approaching Ralks grew louder. Adrian swore under his breath, signaling his team to prepare for combat. The first wave hit hard, the Ralks leaping down from the rocky outcroppings above. Adrian's rifle barked as he dropped one, then another. Harris screamed as a claw raked across his back, but he spun around, firing point blank into the creature's face. "Stay on them," Adrian shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Maine and his Tyranny warriors joined the fray, their energy weapons precise but lacking the human's ferocity. Adrian noticed Maine paused briefly as one of his soldiers was struck down, the alien leader hesitating before resuming fire. "Keep moving, Maine," Adrian barked, covering him with suppressing fire. The fighting grew more desperate as the team worked to secure the munitions. Mendez, his injured arm still in a sling, used his free hand to lob grenades into the advancing horde. Harris, bleeding heavily, refused to fall back, his rifle spitting fire until the barrel overheated. Finally, the cache was opened, revealing a trove of explosives and heavy munitions. "Load up," Adrian shouted. The team worked quickly, distributing the weapons and laying down suppressing fire as the Rauks closed in. When the last of the explosives were secured, Adrian gave the order to retreat. The journey back was a nightmare, the Rauks pursuing them relentlessly, their screeches echoing across the rocky plains. Adrian's leg burned with every step, and he could see the strain on his soldiers' faces as they neared the defensive line. The sound of human gunfire reached their ears, the remaining soldiers having rallied, holding off the Rauks long enough for Adrian's team to return. "Get those munitions into position," Adrian ordered as they crossed the barricades. The final battle was chaos. With the new weapons, the humans and Tyranny were able to repel the Rauks' assault, but the cost was high. By the time the last creature fell, the battlefield was littered with bodies, human and alien alike. Adrian, barely standing, turned to Maine. "Now do you understand?" Maine's antenna drooped slightly as he surveyed the carnage. "Your pain tolerance, your willingness to endure, it is unlike anything we have encountered." "It is humbling." Adrian nodded, too tired to reply. The Tyranny had finally seen what it meant to be human and why, against all odds, humanity refused to break. The battlefield on Saren 4 was deafeningly quiet in the aftermath of the final assault. Smoke rose in faint spirals from the shattered barricades, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the bloodied ground. Colonel Adrian Shaw leaned against a battered metal slab, his body protesting every movement. Around him, the remaining soldiers worked silently, clearing debris and tending to the wounded. It was a victory, but only just. The Rauks had been driven back for now, and their supply corridor remained secure, yet the cost was staggering, the ground littered with the bodies of those who had fought and fallen. Adrian pushed himself upright, wincing as his leg throbbed under his weight. "Colonel Charmaine," he approached slowly, his movements uncharacteristically subdued. "What's the damage on your end?" "We sustained losses," Maine admitted. "Several warriors fell, those who remain are unsettled." His antennae twitched as he glanced at Adrian's soldiers, many of whom were still standing despite injuries that would have left most species incapacitated. "You're not the only ones," Adrian replied, scanning the faces of his own team. Mendez was slumped against a wall, his bandaged arm now reinforced with a makeshift brace. Harris, though pale and unsteady, refused to rest, helping the medics patch up their comrades. Maine's gaze lingered on Harris, his multifaceted eyes reflecting something akin to disbelief. "Your soldiers, they continue to function despite grievous injuries. Some of them should not even be conscious." "Pain's just another problem to solve," Adrian said. "If we can push through it, we do." "At what cost?" Maine asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Adrian met his gaze. "Sometimes the cost doesn't matter. Sometimes you don't have a choice." Maine was silent for a moment, his antennae twitching in thought. "Your willingness to endure defies reason. It is not merely a physical trait. It is a philosophy, a refusal to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds." We have studied countless species, Colonel Shaw. None share this trait. Adrian shrugged, the movement stiff and painful. It's what we do. Doesn't mean it's easy. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Crane, who saluted sharply despite the blood trickling down his temple. Colonel, reinforcements are arriving. Dropships incoming from orbit. They'll be landing within the hour. Adrian nodded. About time. As the reinforcements landed, fresh soldiers and supplies spilling onto the battlefield, the Turani gathered in a tight cluster near their fallen comrades. Adrian watched as Maine gave quiet instructions, the other aliens responding with solemn clicks and murmurs. The reinforcements brought a sense of relief, but for Adrian's team, the adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by the full weight of their injuries and exhaustion. Medics worked tirelessly to stabilize the wounded, their expressions grim as they moved from one soldier to the next. Colonel Dr. Lydia Grant appeared at Adrian's side, her medical kit slung over one shoulder. "You need to sit down before you collapse." "I'm fine," Adrian said automatically, though the pain in his legs suggested otherwise. "Sure you are," Grant muttered, pushing him onto a nearby crate. "You've been running on fumes since yesterday. Let me take a look." As she worked, Maine approached again, his movements hesitant. "Colonel Shaw," he began, his tone formal. "I wish to express my gratitude. Your actions and those of your soldiers ensured our survival. The Rauks would have overwhelmed us without your resilience." "You're welcome," Adrian said, wincing as Grant tightened a bandage around his leg. Maine's antennae swayed thoughtfully. "Your species' capacity for endurance is both remarkable and troubling. You ignore pain, defy logic, and continue when most would have ceased. It is a trait we cannot replicate." "That's why we're still here," Adrian said. Maine tilted his head. "Still here. Still alive. Still fighting. Humanity's history is one long story of pushing through the impossible. Pain, setbacks, loss, it's all part of the deal. We don't give up because we can't afford to." The alien leader was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Your species has shown us something we did not expect. We believed pain was a limitation, a directive to cease activity and preserve the self. But for you, it is merely an obstacle. This changes how we view your kind." Adrian leaned back, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Glad we could clear that up." Maine's antenna twitched in what might have been amusement. "You are a perplexing species, Colonel Shaw, but you are also formidable allies. We will not forget what you have taught us today." With that, the Turani leader turned and rejoined his warriors, leaving Adrian to his thoughts as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first signs of an impending storm began to brew in the sky. Adrian watched the dark clouds gather, knowing there were more battles ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had held the line. They had shown the Turani what humanity was capable of. And they had proven once again that pain was no match for sheer determination.